had a song going through my head when I started thinking about this week's Far Middle storyboard and the sequencing of connection dots. It was, of all things, Fleetwood Mac's Little Lies. I've been a fan of Fleetwood Mac's for a long time, and if I were to list their top 20 songs in their catalog, Little Lies wouldn't make the cut. But I heard it on the radio right before I started thinking on the episode, and I could not remove it from my mind. Doesn't that drive you crazy sometimes? But there was a silver lining. The song Little Lies got me thinking about that as a topic for the episode, which led to the theme of episode 152. The theme will be how little lies, or let's call them fibs, if they deal with huge and core issues, they can propagate into gigantic problems. You'd be surprised. By the way, I am your host, Nick Diolius. I am thrilled to be here with you, and let's get rolling. And we're going to start with our sports dedication. Since the theme of the episode is fibbing, I thought we might have a little bit of fun with the dedication and pull out some of the more noteworthy lies told through sports history, 3 in particular. And these fibs are told and used in all walks of life. You'll recognize them beyond the playing field. You'll know them no matter what your sports acumen might be. So check out this trio of iconic lies. How about not telling the truth on your resume? That's a no-no, happens a lot, and sometimes the most public of figures are caught doing it. Back in 2001, and it's hard to believe it's been over 20 years ago, a college football coach, you might remember the name, George O'Leary, learned the hard way what happens when you're caught doing so. 5 days after being introduced as Notre Dame's new head coach, it was discovered that O'Leary's intriguing credentials were lies. He said that he had a master's degree from an elite school and that he earned varsity letters playing football as an undergrad. Neither were true. And once caught, O'Leary ended up with a statement that read as follows. In seeking employment, I prepared a resume that contained inaccuracies regarding my completion of coursework for a master's degree and also my level of participation in football at my alma mater. These misstatements were never stricken from my resume or biographical sketch in later years. Well, his tenure with the Irish lasted 5 days. Don't lie on your resume, people. How about our second example? Hands-on micromanager who says with a straight face that they intend to be hands-off. Now, we all know somebody like that. Heck, I may have been guilty of such from time to time. But nobody, and I mean no one, was a bigger liar in that department than George Steinbrenner of the Yankees. At first, when he took over control, he promised to the media that, and I'm using his words here, we plan absentee ownership as far as running the Yankees is concerned. We're not going to pretend we're something we aren't. I'll stick to building ships. And for those of you that don't know, Steinbrenner came from the shipbuilding industry. Now, that's what he said to the LA Times on the day that he bought the Yankees. During his totalitarian regime in the Bronx, which is the best way I could describe his tenure, the boss, as he was known, was suspended twice. He hired and fired 14 different managers. The manic Billy Martin, he enjoyed that experience 5 times, by the way, under Steinbrenner. And George made himself more the center of attention than the team itself. Now, he came clean eventually, years later, admitting that to get where I wanted to go, I wasn't going to stay hands off. Yeah, that's for sure, George. Then, in our third and final exemplar of sport lie, there is the tendency for adolescents sometimes to inflate or to fabricate sexual exploits. But what happens when it's done by a world-famous grown man who's making this type of stuff up, to the level where it's both lying and sort of gross? The great Wilt Chamberlain infamously bragged in writing, mind you. He wrote this in his autobiography that was published in the early 1990s. He claimed to have had sexual relations with 20,000 women, different women. Now, someone did the math at the time, and that would have meant that Wilt had sex with 1.2 different women every day since he was 15 years old. That's gross. But years later, he sort of fessed up to the fibbing about his exploits by saying, you do some things for effect, you understand? Yeah, I think we understand, but come on, Will. Now, there are a lot of other famous fibbing events in the annals of sport, too many to cover here, and some that served actually as prior dedication topics, like the fixing of the 1919 World Series and Arnold Rothstein's testimony as to his role, and some that will likely be future dedications all by themselves. Yeah, I'm thinking of Spygate and you, Bill Belichick. But until then, let's dedicate our episode 152 theme of fibbing to 3 historic lies in the world of sport that we can all learn a lesson or two from. Let's discuss a fib that has been propagating through society, economy, and policy. On its face, this fib seems harmless enough and it doesn't stand out. But the little lie is driving big policy. Policy that drives and reaps trillions of dollars in value destruction and ruining quality of life for billions. Once you realize this fib is the foundation and the foundational premise for one of the most consequential policies that we will see in our lifetime, you gain appreciation as to the damage it might be done. So what's the lie? Well, it deals with the scientific basis, foundationally, for the energy transition and climate policies. The lie that if something can be electrified, it can eventually be decarbonized through wind, solar, and energy storage. Simple on its face, but hugely impactful since it drives policy across society, and massively wrong. Because wind and solar, they're not zero carbon forms of energy or electricity. They carry massively heavy carbon footprints across their full life cycle. So you're not reducing, let alone eliminating, CO2 emissions with the use of wind and solar for power generation. All you're doing is displacing and changing where the CO2 emissions are occurring geographically. Just as much and likely more CO2 will be emitted with wind and solar versus natural gas generation and nuclear power. But instead of the CO2 emission occurring at the power plant in the case of natural gas generation, the CO2 emissions occur in places like China, Africa, and Indonesia when it comes to wind and solar, as they and their stuff are being mined, processed, manufactured, and built there, which makes no difference, by the way, to the atmosphere from a CO2 perspective. An economy and society can electrify all at once, and then you can slap on as many wind turbines and solar panels as you can cram into suitable locations to generate the supply of electricity to meet the demand from electrification. But when it's all said and done, doing so will not reduce global CO2 emissions. In fact, it'll grow CO2 global emissions. And your grid and the reliability of electricity, they're going to be eroded greatly because of the intermittent nature of wind and solar. And in the end, they're drivers that we call weather. The next time you hear an expert lecture that if you can electrify something, you can decarbonize it with wind and solar, tell them they're full of it, suggest they take a science class, and refer them to episode 152 of the Far Middle. And do all of that respectfully, of course. You'll be doing them a favor. How about we make a connection to another energy fib? Yeah, let's dispense with all those convenient little lies that are out there that underlie a flawed set of climate policies and energy transition efforts. Until we do that, we're only going to be building our economy and society on a foundation of sand. Now, this fib pertains to the vaunted energy independence of the United States. Before the administrative state and the environmental zealots got their hands on the keys of government and began to set draconian policies aimed at scuttling the domestic energy industry in the United States, the private sector here did an amazing job of innovating and bringing to bear disruptive technologies like the shale revolution, which reformed and vastly improved domestic energy and our energy security and environmental quality and jobs in the economy. It was a massive and epic success story that was just gaining more and more momentum. Until the bureaucratic state and the environmental movement, both led by the left, got control of policy. Now, the fib has to do with the idea that despite attacks on domestic energy and things like oil and natural gas and nuclear and coal and pipelines and power plants, the United States and its private sector continues to improve our energy independence. Heck, President Biden himself touts where the domestic energy industry sits today versus when he took over. But looking at only things like oil, natural gas, and coal in a vacuum, fossil fuels basically, when it comes to energy independence is a flawed approach, especially if policy is mandating and driving massive increases in demand on the grid through electrification. So think of things like EV mandates, and especially if policy is mandating the adoption of widespread wind and solar across the grid to meet the demand with electricity supply. The reality is that wind and solar components and generation, they're largely foreign and imported to this country, China being the largest supplier. And when you account for more of our energy demand coming in the form of electricity, and the fact that policy is mandating more and more of that electricity to come from wind and solar, and that the wind and solar necessarily must be imported primarily from China, you develop a very different picture of where we sit on an energy security scale. We are, I'm sorry to say, not energy independent when you include kilowatt hours in the equation. We're far from it, and it gets worse because our situation continues to erode, with America becoming more energy dependent as the amount of wind, solar, and EVs grow. And it gets worse yet again because much of that dependency is increasingly relying on a supplier known as China. None of it good, and none of it trending in the right direction. Now, if you doubt what I'm saying regarding these two prior fibs and connections regarding energy reality, check out this next connection. Let's recap. First fib we exposed was that wind and solar, and EVs for that matter, are zero carbon. Anything but zero. Largely because their manufacturing processes and life cycles encompass massive CO2 footprints, and they require the use of fossil fuels in places like China. The second fib that we exposed was that America's energy security is improving. It's not improving, and instead it's slipping into a state of dependency and growing worse by the day as we're forced to run headlong into wind, solar, and EV reliance because as things necessarily have to be made or mined or manufactured or processed overseas in places like China. Now, what would be a data point that would serve as proof of those prior two positions that I just presented and the lies that are tied to them? Well, if what I say is true, you should see an explosion in the use of fossil fuels in places like China. This connection shows that very thing is indeed occurring, and it exposes yet another energy fib. Now, what's the fib? Let's start there. You've probably heard or read many an expert lecturing how China is one of the largest, if not the largest, growth market for renewable energy like wind and solar. And these experts tout this as evidence that China is doing exactly what we are being forced to do here in the United States under climate policies. China is astutely retooling its economy to run off of electrification and wind and solar. See, the elite argument goes, China's doing what we said we should do, so let's keep doing that, not get outdone by China. Now that's a fib bordering on a bold-faced lie, because the data and reality on the ground show China is the world's largest growth market for coal-fired generation, and it's not even close. Since the 2015 Paris Agreement, and that's where elites like our self-proclaimed climate czar unilaterally decided to do something drastic about Code Red and mandate the curtailment and use of fossil fuels. But since then, China has managed to increase its coal plant capacity by an unbelievable 223 gigawatts. Now, to put 223 gigawatts of coal power growth in perspective, with the shale revolution and natural gas coupled with wind and solar mandates by the administrative state in the United States, we managed here only a 95 gigawatt reduction in coal-fired capacity on our grid since 2015 and the Paris Agreement, which means China has more than doubled, almost tripled, gigawatt for gigawatt, its growth in coal power plant capacity that the United States has diminished with respect to its coal capacity by. And that's what is the data. Now, what's all the coal-fired electricity and energy being used for in China? It's often used to mine and process and manufacture all the components and feedstocks that are needed to make more and more wind, solar, and EV products to then export and ship to places like the United States, where our energy policies mandate their use because we pretend they are zero carbon forms of energy. It's nuts. It's ludicrous. A bureaucrat, politician, environmentalist, or engineer postulating that wind, solar, and EVs are zero carbon forms of energy or transport, that's embarrassing, and it should be viewed as professional malfeasance. It's not just a fib or a lie, it's a hijacking of fundamental scientific truth and data. The prior connections, they serve as proof points as to why mythology, ideology, they should never be allowed to supplant science and reality when it comes to setting crucial policies, such as energy policy. Yet we saw that very thing happen not long ago, and we may see it occur again, depending on what happens in November. Our next connection will allow me to explain. Think back to 2016 and the presidential election when Trump beat Clinton. Now, that caused quite the tantrum across the left, many of the elites, and much of the expert class. Remember the resistance? And I came across a refresher on what that 2016 to 2020 timeframe was like when it came to those demographics, particularly in the halls of government and with the administrative state and bureaucratic class. So let me share that refresher with 3 examples on what it was like when it came to bureaucracy within government during the Trump administration. And this isn't meant to be read as pro-Trump or anti-Trump. I think it's more of a commentary on the bureaucratic class than anything else. So first example, there was a tracker that was maintained by an elite Ivy League university that happens to be headquartered in New York City. And the tracker was named Silencing Science. The Ivy League Silencing Science tracker tallied over 300 so-called anti-science actions that were taken by the federal government during the Trump administration. Now, what were those actions? And how were they anti-science? Well, they were labeled as things like self-censorship, whatever that would mean. It included budget cuts, personnel changes, and also some vague terms such as research hindrance and misrepresentation. Yes, the elite bureaucratic state resorted to what when held accountable? It worked with elite academia to call fiscal responsibility is nothing more than an attempt to silence science. And if you take a look at our federal budget and you ask yourself what we need, you probably come away with the answer that we need more fiscal responsibility. Is that going to be viewed as an attempt to silence science? And if you try to attempt any change in personnel because of, say, performance, is that immediately going to be labeled as an attempt to silence science if it occurs in some agency even remotely tied to technical or scientific matters? You see where that can go. Now, the second example to share, there were also at that time about 400 scientists, at least those who self-describe as scientists, at the EPA during the Trump administration who claimed to have observed violations of the agency's scientific integrity policy, but didn't report the violations because they had fear of retaliation and they believed that reporting would make no difference and that they thought politics outweighed science. Now you can see what was happening here. The politics and ideology had subsumed science prior to the Trump administration within EPA. Then there was an attempt to reassert science when it came to things like, say, climate policy. And then the ideologues and believers within the EPA, they played the integrity card. The third and last example to share as a refresher, remember when the Trump administration pledged to revive a plan to reclassify scores of federal employees? I'm not sure if you remember that or not. The administration was looking to hold bureaucrats that had prior enjoyed permanent positions within government to have to perform their job duties consistent with what the executive branch instructed. Basically, try to do what your boss asks you to do, not what you feel like doing or what you want to do. Pretty basic and something that all of us in the real world learned day one on the job and that we've been able to abide by ever since, but not in government. In government, once you're in there as an employee, you expect to enjoy permanent protection and to live in a culture of non-accountability and not have to follow instruction from the boss if you happen to not like the boss or if you happen to not have voted for the boss. And then you're expected to be applauded for what is effectively insubordination anywhere else, say in a business or private sector endeavor. And that's why large and unaccountable bureaucracies are a danger to Western Republican democracies. Now, I bring this connection up because we might be seeing a redux of this very behavior, an administrative state temper tantrum, so to speak, depending again on who wins the 2024 presidential election. Because those unaccountable and entitled and entrenched bureaucrats sprawled across the administrative state, they haven't gone anywhere since the Trump administration, and they become even more emboldened and incalcitrant when it comes to ignoring what they want to ignore and doing what they want to do. And they display an even greater arrogance when it comes to shunning their responsibility to serve the American people. Now, if Trump wins the election, and I know that's a big if, and I'm not saying he should, but if he wins the election, bar the door, because we're about to see one of the greatest freakouts in the history of government. And it could make 2016 and those prior Trump term years look mild by comparison. Let's wind down this installment of Far Middle Talk. It was good to highlight those energy fibs and supplant the lies with the truth. They say rust never sleeps, Neither does the need to make informed decisions regarding the maintenance of our energy ecosystem. There comes a time when scientific reality must check the environmental ideology. Hey, wait a minute. Rust never sleeps, and there comes a time. Those two phrases I just threw out there, they are also titles of great Neil Young albums. And that's ironic because Neil's quite the environmentalist. And he might not like what he hears if he were to listen to this episode, I'd venture to guess. But he is a great talent. You can't take that away from him. And I read recently he's changing his position on a famous boycott from a while back. Neil Young about a month ago said his music's going to return to Spotify, which is just more than 2 years after he and a few others removed their catalogs from the music streaming platform over a dispute about vaccine positions. The incident that led to his departure centered on Spotify's multi-million-dollar deal with Joe Rogan. That Rogan podcast is one of the most popular, if not the most popular product on Spotify. But that podcast was accused by Young of spreading what he called fake information about the COVID-19 pandemic and vaccines. There was a group of a couple hundred doctors and scientists who also called on Spotify at the time to take action against what they called mass misinformation events that continue to occur on its platform. And by the way, much of that misinformation proved to be accurate and correct. But, who cares when the elites and experts, when they're outraged, right? And oh, by the way, the controversial discussion that they were referencing on the Rogan podcast was when Rogan had on a medical specialist who was a driving force behind vaccines. The doctor had the audacity to question the efficacy of certain COVID vaccines. That's right, a rocker disputed a medical inventor doctor on vaccines, so the rocker boycotts the platform where the podcast host had the doctor on as a guest. Sort of crazy. Now, Young said his decision to return was in light of Apple and Amazon. He called it serving the same disinformation podcast features that he opposed at Spotify. I guess that's code for Joe Rogan's podcast. And Spotify, by the way, they announced a new deal with Rogan that removed exclusivity, which meant he's able now to put his podcast on Apple, YouTube, and Amazon, these other platforms. So if Young was going to sort of boycott any platform that is running Rogan's podcast, he's not on any platforms at this point. So at least Neil was honest about his decision. He said, I cannot just leave Apple and Amazon like I did Spotify because my music would have very little streaming outlet to music lovers at all. He said that on his website. And I guess it would also stop all those payments to him or whoever owns his catalog as well. But it's not about the money, I'm sure. Other artists, by the way, who pulled their work from the platform back in the beginning of 2022 with Neil Young over this issue were Joni Mitchell and Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Sort of a case of the hippies strike back. But now some are saying it's the hippies selling out, or at least selling out again. And there is, by the way, a rumor going around or chatter that Neil Young may actually re-boycott Spotify. So the drama continues. Now, at the time of the original boycott by Neil Young, the Spotify CEO said he didn't believe in silencing Rogan. So hooray for that. And what I would love to see, I don't know about you, I would love to see Rogan and Young sit down on the podcast, wherever, and look back on what the so-called fake information Rogan put out there was at the time and compare it to what we know as scientific and medical fact today. Because some of that supposed disinformation during the pandemic, as I said earlier, quietly turned out to be quite scientific and quite factual a few years later. I'm thinking about masks and what they do and don't do, the 6-foot distancing rule, 2 weeks to stop the spread. Hey, school closures, they're not going to impede kids from learning. All of that scientific fact and medical certainty back then that today looks a lot different. Anyway, my favorite Neil Young album is Harvest Moon. There are 2 songs on it that I love. The opening track of Unknown Legend, that's a great song. And then the retrospective gem, One of These Days. Yeah, constant listener, one of these days I'm going to sit down and write a long letter. And we will talk about some of it next week. I'll see you then.